Hello, economics students. Today we're going to talk about international trade. So why don't you buckle up and let's take off and get into it. And you see, as you can see in this photograph here, there's a ship. This is taken at the Port of Los Angeles, and the Port of Los Angeles, along with the neighboring Port of Long Beach, California, is the busiest port facility in the United States. I suspect this ship that you see here probably arrived from China with a lot of goods for the United States that were made or at least assembled in China. You can see this is a container ship. Most imported goods actually are put into these containers, those box-like structures that you see on that ship, and those containers can then be easily offloaded and put onto trains or onto the back of a flatbed truck and then shipped to their ultimate destination in the United States. So let's take a look at some of the details on trade in the United States and on international economics in general. First of all, let's start with a few definitions. This might be, repetitive things you already know, but let's just make sure that we do make this clear. An export is a good or a service that is made in the United States, in our case, and is then sold to buyers in another country. So that's an export, and I have a picture here of the Boeing aircraft manufacturing facility up in Washington State. One of our major exports in the United States are aircraft. We're a major producer of aircraft and sell a lot of airplanes to overseas buyers. And then, of course, an import is a good or a service that is purchased from a seller in another country. One of our biggest imports, as I'm sure you probably are aware, are automobiles. So here you see a bunch of cars coming off the ship to make their way to car dealers in the United States. So we do import a lot of cars from overseas. Here's a graph that shows both the amount of exports and imports for the United States. The graph starts in February of 1958, the date I start a lot of my graphs with. And you can see how the amount of exports and imports both have really increased, really beginning in the 1970s. In the mid-1970s, the price of oil started going up, and the United States became an importer of oil in the 1970s, and that started a trend of much more dollar value in trade in America. But we also exported a whole lot more beginning in the 1970s as well. As you look at this graph, the imports are in red, the exports are in blue, and you can see how the gap between exports and imports has really been increasing since the early 1990s. It increased for a while in the 80s as well. Then that gap narrowed, but it's been increasing mostly since then, meaning that we're running a trade deficit in the United States. We import more than we export. There's another interesting thing that you can tell in this graph. The shaded bars that you see here are recessions. And look what happens to exports and imports whenever we enter into a recession. They both decline. But a real interesting feature here, and it's real evident in the recession of 2008, 2009. Interestingly, when we have a recession, the imports in the red will decline more than the exports. Typically speaking, we tend to import less relative to what we export during a time of a recession. And then when the economy is growing and a little bit healthier or even inflationary, that gap tends to widen again, and we start importing more during a healthy economic cycle. So you can really see that here. Notice that how big at the peak there, how big at the peak that gap was. And then the effects of that recession start to hit, and you'll notice that the gap at the trough here is much less than it was at the peak, meaning that the deficit in trade was much less as a result of the recession. The same thing happened in the COVID recession, although it's not quite as readily apparent, probably because the COVID recession was so short-lived. But you can see it in other recessions as well. Here in the early 2000s, again, it's not as evident as it was in 2008, 2009, but in virtually every single recession, the amount of imports will decrease a lot more than the amount of exports decrease. So let's take a look at what we import and what we export. Okay, and what I'm talking about here is the kinds of products that we export and import. And we'll start with exports. First of all, and this may surprise you, our number one export right now is refined petroleum products. In other words, that's the oil products like gasoline and other chemicals that are based off of oil. Typically, they're going to be refined in refineries down around Houston, Texas, or also there's quite a few refineries up in the Northeast as well. But refined petroleum products are our number one export, followed by cars and trucks. That might surprise you. We oftentimes think of the United States as an importer of automobiles, but we actually export a lot too. Crude petroleum, crude oil, is now a major export for the United States. It wasn't until about 4 or 5 years ago, but in the last 3 to 5 years in particular, the amount of oil that we export, crude oil straight from the ground, has really grown a lot, and we are a major exporter now of crude oil. And here we can round out the top 10. Agricultural goods. The United States is a major producer of agricultural goods shipped all over the world. Medical and optical equipment, aircraft and spacecraft I already mentioned, and you can see the others that we are involved in exporting. Let's take a look at our imports. Number one import, probably not a big surprise, is cars and trucks, followed by crude petroleum. So even though we export a lot of crude, we also import a lot of crude, and you will see this a lot in this slide. A lot of the same products that we make in the United States and export abroad, we will also import. And there's reasons for that. It has to do with the cost of production in various countries. Sometimes you'll export goods and sometimes you'll import the same good. Computers, clothing, that's probably not a big surprise. If you look at the tag on the inside of your clothes, you'll see oftentimes those are made overseas. And then rounding out the top 10 again, broadcast and telecom equipment, car parts, packaged medicines, big import item. Gems and precious metals. Look at that. We export a lot of gems and precious metals. We also import a lot of the same. How do you like that last one too? We import a lot of blood and vaccines and anti-sera. Anti-sera is basically antidotes to things like poisons and other bacterial infections. So that's a major item of import into the United States. Let's look at our trading partners. Our top trading partners. Let's start with export partners. Number one export partner is Canada. Probably not a big surprise if you think of the geography of our nation and North America. It makes sense that Canada would be a big export partner. And for the same reason, it probably shouldn't be a huge surprise that Mexico is also a huge export partner for the United States. As a big source of our exports go to Mexico. China is number 3. Japan number 4. South Korea number 5. Maybe a little bit of a surprise there. And let's round out the top 10. We get into Europe, Germany, UK, and the Netherlands. Little Netherlands, a major export partner, a major export destination of U.S. goods. And maybe the final two might surprise you, Brazil and South America and India. India, by the way, is an interesting case, as India has, with its huge population, has become more affluent. They have been buying more and more U.S.-made goods. Okay, let's go to our top import partners. I suspect all of you all would probably guess correctly that the number one import partner for the United States is China, followed by Mexico, followed by Canada. The next largest is Japan. Again, these probably aren't huge surprises. And then Germany. So these are our top 5 import partners. China by far is number 1 in imports. Excuse me. And we round it out with the bottom 5 in the top 10. Surprisingly, Vietnam. Vietnam has been coming up rather rapidly as a major source of goods and services that we import into the United States, as has Korea. Taiwan is big in there. That Taiwan has been moving up in the rankings quite a bit. Ireland, that's a little bit of a surprise too. Ireland does not have a huge population, but they are a major export partner. Both goods and a lot of services are are imported from Ireland, and we'll get into the importation of services in a little bit. And then India. India is also a new country appearing in this list. So those are top export and import partners. Any surprises there? A lot of people are a little bit surprised that Mexico ranks so highly. We oftentimes don't think of Mexico as a wealthy country that would be a major trading partner, but Mexico is a huge trading partner of the United States. In fact, it's our #1 trading partner. Look at that. Mexico, about 2 years ago, became the #1 trading partner of the United States. And by that I mean when we combine the amount of exports and imports with that country. Mexico recently surpassed Canada as our #1 partner. And then, of course, Canada comes in second, China third, Japan fourth, Germany fifth. I would like you not necessarily to know all of the countries in order for exports and in order for imports, but I would like you to know this slide here, our top 5 trading partners in order. That would be a good idea to know. Mexico, Canada, #1 and #2, very close. Significantly behind them comes China, and then even more significantly behind comes Japan and Germany. Okay, why do we trade with other nations? Well, there's really 3 main reasons that I want us to focus on. Reason #1, we can make more money selling stuff overseas than selling domestically. And what you should think about is the law of supply and demand. Okay, so think about what happens if demand increases for the price of a good. When the demand increases, the price of the good will go up. If supply stays relatively constant, demand increases, then you're going to have higher prices for your good that you're trying to sell. Obviously, American producers love it when we can sell overseas because that will increase the demand for the goods that they're manufacturing. So that's one of the reasons we can make more money that way. Another reason is the unequal distribution of resources. Take, for example, a country like Japan. Japan doesn't have any oil, so they've got to import their oil. And Japan and China both import a lot of crude oil from the United States. And why do they import crude oil from the United States and not, say, Saudi Arabia? Because it's cheaper to get oil from the United States to Japan or China than it is to get oil from Saudi Arabia to Japan or China. Therefore, we will be happy to sell them some oil for a good high price, and we'll go ahead and import some oil to make up for what we sell to them from Saudi Arabia. So that's why we will have, oil as a major export and oil as a major import. Countries need our oil. It's cheaper to get our oil, transportation, although all of that is cheaper to get it from the United States than to get it from the Middle East. And then finally, specialization. We specialize in making the stuff that we do the best. And we're going to get into this a lot tomorrow, and really for the next week we're going to talk a lot about specialization. But the United States could spend all its resources making coconuts, but it doesn't make sense for us to do that. We don't have the climate for coconuts. Therefore, it makes sense for the United States to import coconuts, and we will specialize in something that is more productive based on our climate and our resources, something like corn. It's going to make a lot more sense for us to grow corn and export corn than it would for us to grow coconuts and try to export coconuts. We want to specialize on what we can do best. And with that, I'm going to stop this presentation and check Canvas. You may have an assignment there. And we'll continue with specialization tomorrow. Have a great day.